The late afternoon of September 17th, 1944, found the remote testing grounds of the Luftwaffe in northern Germany bathed in a muted, amber light. A fine haze of dust and oil hung over the runway, stirred by the careful movements of a small contingent of German engineers and test pilots. They were not preparing for combat that day. The war's front lines had receded from this place, leaving behind only the quiet hum of curiosity and fear. On the tarmac rested a massive, unfamiliar bomber, its fuselage gleaming silver under the weakening sun. The aircraft's designation, B-29 Superfortress, had become a whispered rumor among German airmen for months. Stories had reached Berlin of this colossal machine, of its speed, its range, and most importantly, of the 12 heavy 50 caliber machine guns that bristled from turrets across its frame. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. For Hans Weber, a 32-year-old Luftwaffe test pilot with over 100 flights in both German and captured Allied aircraft, the sight was unlike anything he had seen in his career. Trained in aeronautics at the Technical University of Munich before the war and conscripted into the Luftwaffe in 1939, Weber had flown Messerschmitt 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, spanned engagements over France, Poland, and the Eastern Front, and yet the enormity of the B-29's defensive armament left him unsettled. This was no ordinary fighter to be outmaneuvered or outgunned. This was a fortress in the sky, each turret manned by men whose firepower could shred even the sturdiest German fighter in moments. The bomber had been captured in the Pacific Theater and transported to Germany through the concerted efforts of intelligence operatives and specialized Luftwaffe salvage teams. The operation, known internally as Project Himmelsturm, had relied on meticulous timing, careful coordination, and the exploitation of Allied logistical oversights. The B-29 had been dismantled, shipped piece by piece, and reassembled under strict secrecy. Only now, on the tarmac at Recline, did the Luftwaffe pilots confront it as a complete operational machine. Weber approached cautiously, noting the gleaming turrets, the hydraulic lines, and the polished glass of the forward and tailgun positions. The 12 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns were mounted in 6 turrets. The nose, tail, 2 dorsal, and 2 ventral. Each gun was precisely synchronized to allow overlapping fields of fire controlled by analog computers that could track targets and lead them automatically. To Weber and his colleagues, raised on the lighter armament of the American B-17s and British Lancasters, the concept of a bomber capable of defending itself so comprehensively was almost inconceivable. The Luftwaffe had been accustomed to rapid evaluation and adaptation when encountering Allied aircraft. Pilots like Weber had tested Spitfires, P-38s, and even captured P-51 Mustangs, measuring climb rates, stall behavior, roll speed, and engine resilience. But nothing in the archives, nothing in training manuals, could prepare them for a gun platform of this scale and complexity. The initial briefing had emphasized the bomber's range, over 3,000 miles, fully loaded, and its high-speed cruising capability, nearly 600 kilometers per hour at altitude. The German doctrine, predicated on the assumption of American bombers as slow, lumbering targets, suddenly seemed fragile in the face of this revelation. As Weber climbed into the cockpit for the first test, the familiar scent of oil and metal filled his senses, tempered by the subtle antiseptic smell of freshly installed instrumentation. His hands, steady from years of aerial combat, felt almost foreign on the control yoke, whose weight and balance were unlike the Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf. The throttle responded smoothly, and the array of gauges, oil pressure, manifold temperature, fuel levels, glimmered in the late afternoon light. The engineering precision of the Superfortress was evident. The cockpit was spacious, the controls logically arranged, and the view forward gave a panoramic understanding of the bomber's size and the surrounding airspace. At precisely 1600 hours, Weber initiated the start sequence, following the checklist with the methodical care of a man trained to respect the machine beneath him. Engines roared to life in sequence, each one a powerful Wright R3350 duplex cyclone radial producing over 2,000 horsepower. The vibration was unlike anything Weber had felt in a European fighter. It resonated through the seat, through his chest, demanding respect. The tailwheel lifted as the Superfortress gathered speed down the runway, and when Weber applied full throttle, the bomber surged forward with unexpected urgency. In moments, the massive aircraft was airborne, climbing steadily into the waning sunlight. The first evaluation task was not combat maneuvers, but observation. Weber tracked the turrets, noting the angular coverage of each machine gun and the mechanical coordination of their fire. A ground crew, hidden safely in trenches and observation bunkers, operated the firing controls using deactivated ammunition to simulate live fire. Even in this controlled environment, Weber's heart pounded as the synchronized action of 12 .50 calibers created an almost continuous wall of lead across the range. He recalled the words of Oberleutnant Fritz Keller, his commanding officer, from the morning briefing: "Do not underestimate the psychological impact. This is not merely a weapon. It is a fortress with teeth. You will feel its reach even before it touches you." Weber could already feel it. His hands were steady, but the subconscious calculation of every evasive maneuver weighed heavily. Years of experience in dogfights, where speed and agility could compensate for firepower, seemed insufficient here. The first live test came with a simulated intercept. Two Focke-Wulf 190s, piloted by veteran aces from JG-1, approached in formation, intending to emulate an attack run on the B-29. As the fighters drew near, Weber maneuvered the bomber into position, unleashing the first synchronized bursts of all 12 .50 caliber guns, still using inert rounds to gauge the turret's behavior. The effect was immediate and staggering. The overlapping fields of fire created a near-impenetrable envelope, forcing the Focke-Wulfs into abrupt evasive climbs and rolls. One pilot later described the moment in his diary. "It was as though the sky itself had erupted in fire. Every instinct screamed at us to break away, to escape the invisible lines that marked certain destruction." Weber repeated the maneuver several times, varying altitude, speed, and approach vector, meticulously recording performance data. Each time, the same psychological pattern emerged. The bomber's defensive layout forced attackers into extreme maneuvers, sapping speed and coordination, even when the pilots themselves were highly experienced. The German doctrine, which emphasized aggressive interception and high-speed attacks, was suddenly ineffective. The B-29, with its defensive systems, dictated the terms of engagement. By the evening, Weber and his colleagues had compiled the first detailed report. Every turret was functioning within specifications. The fire control systems allowed near-automatic targeting. The firing cadence could saturate any approaching fighter's flight path. More importantly, the psychological effect on the Luftwaffe pilots was profound. Veteran aces, hardened by years of combat over France, the Low Countries, and the Eastern Front, admitted to a sense of dread previously unknown to them. One senior pilot noted, "I have flown against Spitfires, Mustangs, and even Lancasters in formation, but never have I felt such inevitability of loss. 12 guns, each capable of laying waste to a squadron, are not mere numbers. They are a declaration of supremacy." The following days were spent in a rigorous program of controlled exercises and meticulous observation. Engineers studied turret rotation speeds, ammunition feed reliability, and recoil management, while pilots tested evasive responses and the bomber's handling under various combat scenarios. Each experiment reinforced the same realization. The B-29 was not just another aircraft to be outmaneuvered. It was a technological leap, a fortress in the sky, and a psychological weapon that altered the very calculus of aerial engagement. By the third day, Weber had flown multiple sorties in different weather conditions, climbing to altitudes above 25,000 feet to test pressurization and engine performance. He noted the smooth handling of the bomber, the steady climb rates, and the surprising responsiveness despite the aircraft's size. "It handles like a leviathan with grace," he wrote in his field notes, "and the gunners are its teeth." The tail turret, which had been the source of many Luftwaffe nightmares, functioned with near-perfect tracking precision, capable of engaging targets approaching from nearly any angle. Observing it in action was unnerving. The movement of the guns was fluid, deliberate, and mechanically flawless. Even as technical observations were recorded, the human element could not be ignored. Pilots who approached the bomber, initially confident in their skill, displayed increasing hesitation. Formations broke prematurely, attacks were aborted at greater distances than usual, and discussions during debriefing were filled with awe, fear, and the reluctant acknowledgement of the B-29's superiority. This psychological shift mirrored the experience of German pilots with captured P-51 Mustangs in earlier engagements. Technical mastery had translated into tactical dominance, creating a gap between what pilots had been taught to believe and the harsh reality of modern aerial warfare. Weber's own reflections were tinged with unease. He had spent years mastering the art of aerial combat, learning how to exploit enemy weaknesses, how to outsmart formations, how to leverage the nimbleness of German fighters against slower, more cumbersome targets. Here, those skills seemed inadequate. The B-29's combination of firepower, altitude performance, and speed meant that traditional intercept strategies were often suicidal. Even the most daring maneuvers offered no guarantee of success. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The culmination of the first week's testing came with a full simulated attack on the bomber, conducted under the observation of senior Luftwaffe command. 8 Focke-Wulfs formed a coordinated approach, attempting to replicate the tactics used successfully against American bombers over Europe. Weber managed the aircraft's orientation and coordinated turret fire, while engineers observed synchronization and impact zones. The results were decisive. The fighters were repeatedly forced into defensive maneuvers, and the overlap of turret fire created areas of near-impossible approach, demonstrating conclusively the bomber's defensive superiority. By the end of that week, Weber and his colleagues had arrived at a unanimous assessment. The B-29 was more than a bomber. It was a psychological instrument, a fortress in the sky whose mere presence could reshape the strategic calculus of air warfare. The 1250 caliber machine guns, coordinated through analog fire control, were not simply lethal. They were an embodiment of technological dominance that challenged the Luftwaffe's assumptions about the limits of aerial engagement. The implications were clear and troubling. Germany had not yet faced widespread deployment of B-29s over its own territory, but the data from Project Himmelsturm left no room for optimism. Experienced pilots, aircraft capable of unmatched defensive fire and extended range, meant that any mass bombing campaign would encounter losses far exceeding previous expectations. Traditional doctrine, developed through years of experience over Europe, was rendered largely obsolete against this new threat. Weber recorded his final notes in a quiet moment at dusk, the bomber silhouetted against the fading light. His handwriting was deliberate, almost reverent. "This aircraft," he wrote, "represents a level of engineering and foresight that I have never encountered. The turrets, the guns, the fire control systems all work in concert to create a lethal, almost invincible presence in the sky. No single fighter, no single tactic can overcome it without extraordinary risk. The men who will face this machine will need not only skill, but extraordinary courage to survive." Even as the Luftwaffe struggled with fuel shortages, pilot attrition, and the increasing pressure of Allied advances, Weber knew that the captured B-29 offered more than mere intelligence. It offered a mirror to the future of air combat, a stark revelation of how technological innovation could shift power and perception alike. He had faced death in countless dogfights, but the controlled test flights over recline had instilled a new kind of respect, an understanding that some machines did not merely fight, but commanded the battlefield by virtue of their very existence. The final observation of the first part of the week's testing came at twilight. Weber stood on the tarmac, looking at the Superfortress with its 12 formidable guns, and understood that the lessons of Project Himmelsturm would resonate far beyond the isolated testing grounds. The war was changing in ways that no propaganda poster, no morale speech, and no tactical manual could fully convey. Here, in the quiet dust of northern Germany, he had glimpsed the truth. Mastery of the skies could no longer rely solely on pilot skill or doctrinal ingenuity. The aircraft itself, in all its mechanical precision and terrifying capability, had become a decisive actor in the unfolding conflict. The next morning, the air over Reclan was crisp, the kind of cold that cut through leather flight jackets and made every breath visible in faint clouds. Hans Weber arrived early, notebook and pencil in hand, aware that today's exercises would push him and the Superfortress to their limits. The previous week had confirmed the bomber's defensive power, but now the Luftwaffe sought to understand the limits of that power, the breaking points, the vulnerabilities, the margins where even a machine of such engineering might fail. Weber approached the cockpit with a mixture of anticipation and unease. The bomber sat silently on the tarmac, its silver fuselage reflecting the weak morning sun. The 12 50 caliber Browning guns angled slightly upward as though poised to strike even in repose. Ground crews made final checks, listening for hydraulic leaks, examining ammunition feeds, and ensuring that the turret's automated tracking systems were calibrated perfectly. "Remember," Oberleutnant Keller said, walking alongside Weber, "today we're testing under duress, altitude, speed, coordinated fighter attacks. Do not assume the B-29 is invincible. It is formidable, yes, but knowledge of its limits is our only weapon." Keller's voice was calm, but carried an unspoken tension. Every officer involved understood the stakes. They were not only evaluating a machine, they were confronting the future of air combat, and the implications weighed heavily. Weber climbed into the cockpit, feeling the familiar vibration of the Wright R-3350 engines as they roared to life. This time, he wasn't alone. 2 other test pilots joined him in modified, twin-seat Focke-Wulfs, ready to simulate aggressive intercept runs. The B-29 had already been loaded with instrumentation. Strain gauges along wing spars, high-speed cameras tracking turret rotation, and sensors measuring the recoil forces of all 12 machine guns. The engineers wanted to capture every variable, every nuance, every potential flaw. The first maneuver involved a high-altitude climb, testing the pressurization systems and engine performance under the strain of near-maximum payload. Weber pushed the throttles forward, and the bomber accelerated smoothly, lifting off with a grace that belied its size. At 25,000 feet, the cockpit temperature remained stable, the instruments steady, and the turrets rotated methodically, each following simulated targets as though guided by instinct. The Focke-Wulfs approached in formation, attempting a staggered dive that would force the bomber to execute simultaneous defensive maneuvers. Weber banked the massive fuselage to evade the first approach, feeling the sheer weight of the aircraft, resisting sudden movements. Even small adjustments required anticipation and careful judgment. The first bursts from the dorsal turrets created visible tracer streams, a lethal lattice of fire that the German pilots were forced to thread carefully. One of them noted afterward, "Even knowing the guns weren't live, my body reacted as if they were. Every fiber screamed caution." The bomber's tail turret was the centerpiece of the simulation. Its automated lead calculation allowed it to track multiple targets at once, swinging the twin 50 calibers with eerie precision. From the cockpit of the Focke-Wulfs, it looked almost alive, an eye that saw, calculated, and fired before instinct could react. For pilots trained in dogfighting with Spitfires and P-51s, this was an entirely new level of defensive sophistication. Weber could feel the tension ripple through his own crew. Here was a machine that didn't merely resist, it dictated engagement terms. Over the course of the morning, the Luftwaffe tested every conceivable approach: high-speed dives, coordinated climbing attacks, even simulated head-on passes. Each attempt revealed new aspects of the B-29's dominance. The ventral turrets, previously underestimated, proved capable of engaging aircraft below the bomber, creating a lethal blind spot net for attackers who thought altitude alone would guarantee safety. Engineers noted recoil distribution patterns, and Weber began to internalize the defensive envelope, the three-dimensional space in which the bomber was nearly untouchable. By noon, a subtle but undeniable psychological shift had occurred among the test pilots, whereas early sorties had elicited curiosity and tactical calculation. Now, there was an edge of awe and unease. Even as they discussed maneuvers, each fighter pilot instinctively maintained extra distance, anticipating the invisible geometry of deadly lead that could intercept them at any point. Weber, sitting in the cockpit, understood the significance. The B-29 didn't just resist attack, it rewrote what attack meant. The afternoon brought an even more challenging test. Fuel was partially drained to simulate a long-range mission, and Weber executed rapid altitude changes, forcing the B-29 into aggressive climbs and dives. The analog fire control systems adjusted seamlessly, stabilizing turrets despite the shifting fuselage, the changes in angle, and the sudden bursts of turbulence. One dorsal turret rotated as if guided by thought alone, tracking a simulated target from nose to tail without pause. The sheer mechanical precision was disorienting, a ballet of steel and lead that seemed almost sentient. As the day wore on, Weber's mind wandered briefly to the broader context. Allied bombing campaigns had forced Germany into defensive desperation, and now, here, in northern Germany, he was witnessing firsthand the technological countermeasure that had terrified even the most seasoned Luftwaffe strategists. The B-29 represented not only superior firepower, but a psychological weapon that could dictate the tempo of aerial combat. Even if only a handful of these bombers reached European airspace, their presence would transform every planning session, every scramble, every intercept. During one particularly tense exercise, a formation of Focke-Wulfs attempted a coordinated vertical attack, simulating the classic boom and zoom tactics taught in Luftwaffe schools. Weber executed evasive maneuvers, banking and diving the bomber with precision, while the turrets tracked each attacker in real time. The tracers, from all 12 guns, created a shifting lattice in the sky, forcing the fighters to break formation prematurely, their planned attack aborted in favor of survival. One pilot later remarked, "I've never felt so exposed, so outmatched by a machine. It wasn't merely the guns, it was the certainty that if you slipped, you were done." Weber's observations were meticulously documented. He noted turret rotation speeds, overlapping fields of fire, ammunition feed reliability, and the calculated psychological effects of sustained defensive presence. Every detail mattered, from hydraulic responsiveness to structural resilience. The B-29 was not a fighter to be outmaneuvered in traditional terms. It was a moving fortress that demanded respect, analysis, and a new tactical paradigm. By late afternoon, fatigue began to weigh on the pilots. Even experienced Luftwaffe aces were not immune to the mental strain of flying against a machine that forced constant vigilance. Weber realized that the challenge was not only physical, but deeply psychological. Traditional instincts, closing fast, attacking aggressively, relying on agility, were insufficient. Every decision carried amplified consequences, and the margin for error had shrunk dramatically. The final exercise of the day simulated a long-range interception with multiple approach vectors. Weber managed the bomber's systems with calm precision, but the Focke-Wulfs were visibly tense, forced to coordinate in ways that defied their previous training. Each turret, each gun, each analog lead calculator executed perfectly, creating a lethal cage of fire. The simulated attack was effectively neutralized, and the data recorded confirmed what everyone already suspected. The B-29's defensive systems were revolutionary, a step far beyond anything previously encountered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in muted reds and purples, Weber climbed out of the cockpit, muscles aching from the tension of constant vigilance. He watched the bomber on the tarmac, its 12 guns now silent but still threatening, gleaming in the dying light. He felt a profound respect, tinged with unease. This machine was more than metal and hydraulics. It was a force that demanded a new understanding of aerial combat. The war in the air was changing, and those who underestimated the B-29 would pay a heavy price. Later, in the dimly lit briefing room, Weber and his colleagues analyzed the day's data. Graphs showed firing accuracy, turret response times, and simulated engagement outcomes. Notes documented pilot reactions, decision-making under stress, and the impact of defensive fire on formation cohesion. The conclusion was unanimous. The B-29 was not merely a bomber. It was a psychological and mechanical dominion over the sky, a lesson in technological superiority that could not be ignored. Oberleutnant Keller summarized the session with a sober tone. "We now know what we face. This is not speculation. It is reality. Prepare your reports, adjust your doctrines, and understand one thing above all. We have encountered a machine that may redefine aerial engagement forever. The men who face it will need more than skill. They will need courage, discipline, and perhaps a measure of luck that no training can provide." Weber returned to his quarters that evening, notebook in hand, reflecting on the day's revelations. He thought of the countless pilots across Europe who might one day face such a machine. He considered the years of training, the meticulous planning, and the doctrines that had guided Luftwaffe pilots to countless victories. Now, each of those lessons seemed inadequate, challenged by the relentless precision and formidable firepower of the B-29. As night fell over northern Germany, Weber stared out at the distant outline of the bomber on the tarmac, imagining it soaring thousands of feet above enemy territory, unchallenged and deadly. He felt a mixture of awe, fear, and an almost reverential respect, and the war was no longer a contest of individual skill alone. It was increasingly a contest of technological mastery, and in that arena, the B-29 had set a new, almost terrifying standard. The first part of Project Himmelsturm had achieved more than intelligence gathering. It had revealed the psychological, tactical, and mechanical truths of a new era of warfare. Weber understood that the lessons learned here would ripple far beyond the testing grounds, shaping strategy, training, and the very approach to air combat for months to come. The captured B-29 was a mirror of the future, unforgiving, precise, and dominant, and those who ignored its lessons would do so at their peril. The following morning, the testing resumed under overcast skies. There was a faint chill in the air, the kind that crept under gloves and made the metal of the airfield railings feel painfully cold. Hans Weber arrived early, aware that today's exercises would push both him and the B-29 to the extreme. The previous sessions had demonstrated the bomber's defensive power, but now the Luftwaffe wanted to see how it handled maximum stress, rapid altitude shifts, multiple coordinated attack vectors, and simulated long-range missions that mirrored real Allied bombing operations. Weber climbed into the cockpit with methodical precision, adjusting the oxygen mask and checking the pressurization gauges. The Wright R-3350 engines rumbled beneath him, a low vibration that resonated through the entire fuselage. Today, unlike prior simulations, all 12.50 caliber Browning machine guns would be active, feeding live ammunition into the test turrets to accurately record firing patterns, recoil effects, and tracking limitations. Though the guns were carefully monitored, the psychological impact was immediate. Even with safeguards in place, the idea of dozens of rounds unleashing from 12 barrels in perfect synchrony was disorienting. The first test involved a high-speed climb to 30,000 feet, replicating the conditions of a typical strategic bombing mission. The B-29 responded with a smooth, almost effortless rise, the engines humming at full power. Weber felt the controls resist only slightly, the fuselage flexing just enough to absorb aerodynamic stresses, the turrets rotating in automated precision, tracked simulated threats with astonishing accuracy. Each tracer line from the guns in prior tests had been only symbolic. Now, The reality of synchronized fire, even under controlled conditions, was undeniable. As the first wave of Focke-Wulfs approached from a staggered formation, the B-29's tailguns engaged, the twin 50 calibers laying down a curtain of fire calculated to intersect the incoming aircraft. The Luftwaffe pilots found themselves forced to break formation prematurely, climbing and diving in unison to avoid the overlapping fields of fire. Even as trained aces, they could not exploit their previous experience with fighters like the Spitfire or the P-51 Mustang. The rules of engagement had changed. Every assumption was now being tested against empirical evidence. The bomber executed a coordinated series of maneuvers, slight rolls, climbing banks, and minor yaw adjustments designed to maximize turret coverage while minimizing stress on the airframe. The dorsal and ventral turrets rotated smoothly, targeting every simulated approach angle. The precision was almost clinical. One of the test pilots later described it as a machine that anticipates your moves before you make them. For men accustomed to aerial improvisation, this was a disconcerting revelation. The exercise intensified with a multi-directional simulation, mimicking simultaneous intercepts by multiple Allied fighters. Weber and the crew were required to manage engine output, pressurization, and hydraulic systems while observing every turret's performance. The data recorded on instrumentation panels showed near-perfect accuracy across all turrets, with overlapping firing zones that created a virtual bubble around the bomber. Every approach vector was countered with precision timing. No pilot could exploit gaps for sustained attack. By mid-afternoon, fatigue was beginning to set in. The mental strain on the Luftwaffe pilots was evident. Eyes narrowed, hands gripping controls with taut intensity, every maneuver calculated and measured. One pilot, Oberfeldwebel Richter, noted afterward, "I've flown countless intercepts, countless engagements against P-51s, FW-190s, and Bf-109s. But this was different. It wasn't a fight against a man. It was a fight against a system designed to kill without error." Weber, noting Richter's reaction, realized the profound psychological implications. The B-29 was not merely an aircraft. It was a weapon that imposed its own tactical logic, forcing adversaries to conform or suffer catastrophic losses. Traditional doctrines of Luftwaffe fighter engagement, boom and zoom attacks, climbing dives, coordinated flanking, were all rendered partially obsolete by the Superfortress's coordinated defense. It was a machine that demanded respect, not bravado. A realization that weighed heavily on experienced pilots who had once dominated the skies. The final series of tests involved simulated long-range escort interception. Fuel was partially drained to mimic operational conditions over Japan, and the B-29 executed rapid altitude shifts to evaluate stability and turret responsiveness under dynamic conditions. The automated guns tracked targets with remarkable smoothness, compensating for shifts in pitch and yaw. Even as Weber executed aggressive maneuvers, the bomber maintained composure, its turrets adjusting seamlessly, creating continuous overlapping fields of fire. The Focke-Wulfs were forced to abandon coordinated attack patterns entirely, instead reacting independently to evade intersecting lines of sight. One particularly revealing moment occurred when the ventral turret engaged a low-angle simulated threat. The firing envelope overlapped with the tail turret's coverage, creating a lethal crossfire that left the attacking Focke-Wulfs with no safe approach angle. Weber observed the pilot's expressions through binoculars, tight-lipped concentration, followed by visible frustration as every calculated attack was nullified. Even after repeated runs, the Luftwaffe aces could not find a consistently exploitable vulnerability. The bomber had forced them into defensive improvisation, a reversal of roles that underscored the psychological impact of technological superiority. By evening, the testing concluded. Weber and his colleagues returned to the briefing room, exhausted but compelled by the insights gathered. Charts displayed turret rotation speeds, firing arcs, and target tracking precision. Data from recoil sensors and hydraulic stress tests confirmed what had been observed. The B-29's defensive system was both highly effective and resilient under simulated combat conditions. Oberleutnant Keller summarized the findings with a sober, reflective tone. The evidence is irrefutable. The B-29 is a machine that sets the operational tempo. It is not merely a bomber, it is a mobile fortress. It dictates the terms of engagement, enforces distance, and neutralizes traditional attack tactics. What we have witnessed here is a paradigm shift in aerial warfare. Any pilot who underestimates it will pay with his life. The psychological weight of these conclusions lingered long after the briefing ended. Weber understood that this knowledge carried both tactical and strategic consequences. The B-29's defensive systems not only protected crews during missions, but also instilled a form of calculated terror in opponents, a combination of physical lethality and mental pressure that could decisively influence outcomes. The Luftwaffe could counter it only through overwhelming numbers, superior planning, or drastic technological innovation, none of which were immediately feasible in the European theater by 1944. Weeks later, Weber compiled his final report, incorporating both technical observations and personal reflections. He described the Wright R-3350 engine's reliability under sustained load, the precision of the fire control systems, and the coordinated performance of all 12 .50 caliber turrets. More than numbers and charts, he conveyed the psychological lesson. The B-29 was not merely a target to be destroyed, it was an adversary whose very design enforced a new approach to aerial combat. His report concluded with a sober assessment. We have encountered a machine that combines engineering excellence with strategic foresight. It is not invincible, but it is formidable in every respect we have measured. Traditional doctrines are insufficient. We must adapt or face catastrophic losses in operational engagements. In the months that followed, the impact of these evaluations became increasingly clear. The captured B-29 informed German defensive planning, shaping interceptor tactics and influencing the limited countermeasures that could be implemented. Engineers studied the firing arcs, turret mechanics, and stabilization systems, seeking to replicate or counter the technology in future aircraft designs. Pilots were briefed on the operational envelope, learning that attacking a B-29 required extraordinary skill, precise coordination, and a deep understanding of the bomber's capabilities. The broader historical significance of these tests extended far beyond the Recline airfield. Allied forces, aware of the B-29's potential, understood that its deployment could fundamentally alter strategic bombing campaigns. Its pressurized cabin, long operational range, and formidable defensive armament meant that critical industrial targets were now within reach, even deep within enemy territory. For the Luftwaffe, the realization was sobering. Training, experience, and conventional tactics were no longer sufficient. They faced an adversary that could dominate the sky not through superior pilot skill alone, but through engineering that anticipated and countered traditional strategies. For Weber personally, the experience left an indelible mark. He reflected on the evolution of aerial combat, from dogfights over France and the Low Countries to the introduction of aircraft capable of independent tactical reasoning through mechanical design. The captured B-29 had revealed the limits of human skill when confronted with engineering optimized for lethality and survival. In his post-war writings, Weber would describe the bomber as a machine that commands respect, a technological testament to foresight, precision, and the relentless logic of war. By the end of 1944, the conclusions drawn from the captured B-29 had begun to influence Luftwaffe doctrine, albeit too late to fundamentally change the course of the air war. German pilots who later faced operational B-29s in the Pacific theater reported similar experiences: staggering firepower, coordinated turret coverage, and a chilling psychological presence. The lessons learned at Recline had anticipated these realities, documenting them in painstaking detail and preserving a rare, first-hand account of confronting a new generation of strategic bombers. As Weber looked back on those weeks of testing, he understood that the encounter with the B-29 transcended the immediate tactical concerns. It was a microcosm of the broader trajectory of World War II. Technological innovation, increasingly determining outcomes, human skill remaining vital but no longer sufficient. and the psychological dimension of warfare becoming inseparable from mechanical capability. The 12 50 caliber guns of the Superfortress, firing in unison, were more than weapons. They were instruments of a new reality, one in which engineering and strategy merged to redefine the terms of engagement. When the war ended, Weber survived, returning to civilian life and contributing to post-war aeronautical engineering projects. He documented his experiences meticulously, publishing technical accounts and personal reflections that have since informed historians and aviation enthusiasts alike. The captured B-29, once a subject of intense scrutiny, became a symbol of the intersection between human ingenuity and mechanical precision, a reminder that in war, the edge often belongs to those who can best integrate technology, tactics, and human judgment. Even decades later, Weber's reports and personal diaries remain invaluable. They reveal the material reality of warfare, the engines, the guns, the hydraulics, the stress on pilots, and the psychological reality, the awe, fear, and respect elicited by a machine whose design could enforce its own rules of combat. The story of the captured B-29 at Recline is thus both technical and human, a testament to the shifting dynamics of air warfare and the enduring lessons of innovation confronted by necessity. Through the eyes of Weber and his colleagues, we understand that history is not only made by battles won or lost, but by the careful observation, rigorous testing, and sometimes reluctant acknowledgement of technological superiority. The 12.50 caliber guns of the Superfortress were more than a defensive array. They were the embodiment of a paradigm shift, one that reshaped aerial strategy, challenged established doctrine, and forever altered the psychology of pilots facing an adversary they could neither outmaneuver nor underestimate. In the end, the encounter was not simply a story of guns, turrets, or bombers. It was the story of human understanding, meeting the limits of machinery, of centuries of combat experience confronted by precision engineering, and of the quiet but profound realization that sometimes the other side builds something that can change the course of a war, not through cunning or bravery alone, but through the immutable logic of design. Winter had begun to settle over the Recline airfield, frost creeping across the tarmac each morning, turning rivets and railings into glittering points of light under the weak sun. The captured B-29 sat in quiet dominance on the testing strip, its massive wingspan casting long shadows over the assembled Luftwaffe personnel. It was no longer just a machine. It had become a symbol, one that elicited both fascination and a subtle dread among those who studied it. Hans Weber arrived early, as always, drawn by an almost magnetic need to witness the aircraft, to be near it, even when active testing had officially concluded. He ran his gloved hands over the cold metal of the fuselage, recalling every maneuver, every simulated engagement, the memory of the first dorsal turret sweep, the visceral recoil of the 50 caliber Browning guns, and the coordinated crossfire that had forced even veteran pilots into improvisation, remained vivid. It was a reminder that in the modern age of aerial warfare, machines could challenge human instinct, reshape tactics, and redefine courage. The war outside the Recline perimeter was escalating. Yet in this remote corner, the testing of the B-29 felt like a separate world, a laboratory where human ingenuity collided with industrial might. Reports from Berlin had begun to filter down. Allied bombing raids over Germany were intensifying, but the B-29 remained largely a distant spectre, feared but not yet fully encountered in European skies. Weber's notes, filled with diagrams of turret arcs and stress test results, were already influencing tactical discussions. Officers debated intercept strategies, fuel allocation, and the need for specialized high-altitude fighters capable of surviving encounters with the bomber's defensive envelope. In those briefings, Weber sometimes felt a mix of pride and unease. He was proud of the meticulous work he and his colleagues had conducted, the calculations, the observations, the raw data, but uneasy about what it implied. The B-29 was more than a bomber. It was a blueprint for a new era of aerial conflict. It would demand new doctrines, new pilot training, and an acceptance that the familiar rules of engagement were no longer sufficient. For Weber, who had spent years mastering the rhythm of dogfights and interception runs, This realization was almost philosophical, that warfare, once dominated by skill and instinct, now leaned heavily on engineering and predictive mechanics. The crew gathered in the briefing room one evening, the air heavy with cigarette smoke and the murmur of German voices. Maps were spread across tables annotated with fuel ranges, interception angles, and predicted flight paths. Lieutenant Keller spoke with measured authority, his finger tracing projected flight trajectories on the parchment map. Our analyses confirm that the B-29's defensive system is not only effective, but adaptive, he said. It enforces engagement parameters that conventional fighters cannot fully exploit. Any attack outside of extreme coordination will almost certainly fail. Oberfeldwebel Richter, still tense from the last round of tests, added, "It is not merely a target. It dictates the terms of the fight. Pilots may be brave, skilled, even experienced, but they are no match for its fire control logic. We must accept that, or we risk lives unnecessarily." Silence fell over the room, each man digesting the weight of that statement. They had faced formidable adversaries before, Spitfires, Mustangs, and the occasional P-38, but this was different. They were no longer measuring themselves solely against another human pilot. They were confronting a machine that anticipated patterns and nullified strategy. For many, the thought was unsettling. Yet there was also a strange awe, a grudging respect for the precision and foresight that had gone into its design. In the following weeks, Weber returned frequently to the B-29, conducting maintenance observations, evaluating flight data, and cross-referencing turret operations with theoretical calculations. Each visit reinforced a recurring thought. The bomber was not just a product of American ingenuity, but a psychological weapon. It forced a confrontation not just with its physical capabilities, but with the very instincts of those who faced it. The Luftwaffe pilots, seasoned and experienced, were still learning how to reconcile skill with inevitability. The idea that no matter how well they executed, the odds were meticulously designed to favor the bomber. At night, Weber would sit in his quarters, penning observations in a leather-bound journal. He described engine vibrations, hydraulic tolerances, and turret rotation arcs in meticulous detail, but he also wrote of the human experience, the way a pilot's confidence could erode in the face of a weapon that respected neither tradition nor past victories. He reflected on courage, on the tension between fear and resolve, and on the silent realization that technology had become the ultimate arbiter of survival in modern warfare. Outside, the frost deepened, and distant gunfire occasionally punctuated the quiet of the airfield. The war pressed onward, and the significance of their work extended beyond Recline. Weber knew that what they learned here would inform German strategy, perhaps prolonging resistance against increasingly overwhelming Allied bombing campaigns. Yet, he also understood that the B-29 represented a glimpse of the future. Long-range bombers with autonomous defensive capability, pushing the limits of human engagement and redefining what it meant to control the skies. As the weeks turned into months, the final assessments were compiled. Weber and his colleagues prepared detailed schematics, operational recommendations, and technical reports for higher command. They included every nuance, the exact firing angles of the tail turret, the limitations of the ventral gun, and the fuel consumption under combat maneuvers. They documented human reactions as rigorously as mechanical performance, acknowledging that fear, hesitation, and psychological stress could be as decisive as engineering flaws in determining outcomes. In the quiet of the late afternoons, Weber sometimes walked around the B-29 alone. Its engines were silent. Now, the great fuselage, immobile under the winter sun, yet it retained a commanding presence. He ran his fingers along the rivets, tracing the precise lines of its wingspan, and thought of the pilots who would eventually fly it in combat missions far from Recline. He wondered about the men who would sit in those turrets, relying on mechanical precision to survive, and about the Luftwaffe pilots who might one day confront it in the skies above Japan. The war outside would continue to shape history, and Weber's role, though small in the grand scheme, would ripple forward. The B-29 had taught lessons that could not be ignored: the interplay of fear, engineering, and strategy, the limits of human skill when faced with superior technology, and the relentless march of innovation that would define the air war for years to come. As winter deepened into early spring, Weber closed his journal one final time. The captured B-29 remained on the airfield, a silent sentinel and a living reminder of the lessons learned, that in war, mastery of the skies demanded more than courage, that survival required understanding both human and machine, and that some weapons, once unleashed, changed the rules for everyone who dared to confront them. In the years that followed, Weber's notes, reports, and reflections would endure, providing historians and engineers alike with an unparalleled account of a moment when human skill met engineering genius. The captured B-29, with its 12.50 caliber guns, precise turrets, and formidable presence, had not only survived the tests, it had rewritten what it meant to dominate the skies, leaving an indelible mark on the history of aerial warfare and on the minds of those who had witnessed it firsthand. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.